Herzlich willkommen zur zweiten Veranstaltung in unserer Reihe Digitalisierung, feministisch und dekolonial. Mein Name ist Francesca Schmidt und ich habe diese Reihe konzipiert und darf sie heute zusammen mit Hanna Lichtentäler durch den Abend führen. Und bevor ich Nishant Shah vorstelle, die Personen, weswegen wir heute überhaupt hier sind, möchte ich noch ganz kurz was zu Hanna, zu mir und zum Ablauf des heutigen Abends sagen. Hanna Lichtentäler, meine Co-Moderation, studierte Bachelor und Master im Bachelor und Master Nordamerika-Studien mit den Schwerpunkten Medienkultur und Gender in Berlin, England und Michigan und schloss mit ihrer Masterarbeit zum Thema Reimagining Feminism Spike Lee's She's Gotta Have It as a Netflix Series ab. Vor dem Studium absolvierte sie eine 2-jährige bilinguale Ausbildung zur Industriekauffrau in Madrid. Und sie arbeitet derzeit als Referentin für Medien und Digitales beim Kinderschutzbund Bundesverband. Sie ist außerdem Mitglied bei Netzforma, einem Verein für feministische Netzpolitik. Herzlich willkommen, Hanna. Wunderbar, dass du heute mit mir das hier co-moderierst. Ich, die Sie auch heute hier durch den Abend führen darf, bin Referentin für intersektionales Erinnerungs- und Transformationswissen mit einem Schwerpunkt auf Digitalisierung in der Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung und dem Bereich Digitalisierung aus intersektional-feministischer Perspektive bin ich schon sehr lange unterwegs und sehr lange verbunden. Davor habe ich den Schwerpunkt feministische Netzpolitik, Digitalpolitik beim Gunda-Werner-Institut für Feminismus und Geschlechterdemokratie aufgebaut und auch verschiedentlich dazu veröffentlicht. Das jetzt soweit zu mir. Noch ganz kurz was jetzt hier zu dem Format, in dem wir uns heute wieder treffen. Das ist das Webinarformat. Nishant wird einen ungefähr 30-minütigen Vortrag halten auf Englisch. Sie können jederzeit Ihre Fragen in die Q&A stellen, also Fragen und Antworten. Hanna wird die nachher ein bisschen clustern und aufs Podium zurückspielen, sofern sie dann zu clustern sind oder der Bedarf besteht. Sie können aber natürlich auch gern Ihre Hand heben und zu uns aufs Podium kommen. Ich würde Sie dann einfach hochholen und natürlich auch sozusagen gern mit uns ins Gespräch kommen. Genau, die Veranstaltung findet Deutsch-Englisch statt. Das haben wir jetzt ja schon mehrfach besprochen. Ich werde heute bei Deutsch bleiben, mehr oder weniger, damit wir hier nicht so einen Sprachenwirrwarr haben werden. Soweit. Die Reihe Digitalisierung, feministisch und dekolonial eröffnet machtkritische Perspektiven auf die digitale Transformation und Transformationsprozesse und fragt unter anderem nach deren Auswirkungen auf marginalisierte Communities. Wir möchten Digitalisierung eben als gesellschaftlichen Transformationsprozess verstehen. Und als solcher bedarf er nicht nur technischer und finanzieller Ressourcen in der Umsetzung, sondern vielmehr ist auch das Wissen um solche Veränderungsprozesse notwendig. Und dieses Wissen ist sozusagen in Gesellschaft vorhanden, auch in vielen marginalisierten Communities vorhanden. Und um Gesellschaft in ihrer Pluralität und in ihrer Diversität, in der wir uns befinden, letztlich auch in diese Prozesse einbinden zu können, sind machtkritische Perspektiven, wie ja Feminismus eine sein kann, intersektionale auch, unabdingbar. In dieser Veranstaltungsreihe sollen also Expertinnen zur digitalen Transformation neue Perspektiven auf das Feld eröffnen. Im Sinne einer dekolonialen Praxis wird es darum gehen, Wissen, was bisher an den Rändern verortet war, zu zentrieren. Und wir möchten auch diskutieren, wie unterschiedlich bisher marginalisierte Communities die digitale Transformation eben aktiv mitgestalten können und nicht nur einfach irgendwie mitgenommen werden, im besten Falle. Heute soll es um Fragen von vergeschlechtlicher digitaler Infrastruktur und Plattform gehen. Den Unterschied kann uns Nishant dann vielleicht noch mal ein bisschen erläutern. Denn obwohl wir sehr viel über Plattform als Infrastruktur zum Beispiel von Öffentlichkeiten sprechen, wird dem Begriff und der Materialität geschlechtsspezifischer Praktiken wenig Aufmerksamkeit geschenkt. Obwohl Geschlecht auf diesen Plattformen präsent ist, ist es nicht notwendigerweise entscheidend für die Analyse dieser plattformbasierten Praktiken. In dem Vortrag wird Nishant Shah darauf eingehen, wie Geschlechterpolitik in der Logik und Infrastruktur dieser Plattform kodiert ist. Und er schlägt unter anderem vor, dass wir aufhören, Plattformen als technologische Artefakte zu betrachten, auf denen die Bedingungen von Geschlecht operationalisiert, also messbar werden. Diese Sichtweise lässt uns nämlich glauben, dass geschlechtsspezifische und sexualisierte Gewalt im Internet ein Ausnahmezustand sind und nicht die gesellschaftliche Regel und auch die strukturelle Regel und dementsprechend auch den Plattformen inhärent ist. Und sie lässt uns auch glauben, dass wir dieses Problem durch bessere Regulierung und Governance beheben können. Genau, und Nishant schlägt vor, dass wir Gender als diskursive wie auch analytische Kategorie nutzen, um den Diskurs über Plattformen neu zu schreiben und die Versprechen der Plattform zu erkennen, die in den vorherrschenden Erzählungen als selbstverständlich angesehen und nicht in Frage gestellt werden. Nishant Shah ist Feminist, Humanist und Technologe. Er ist Associated Professor für globale Medien und Direktor des Digital Narrative Studios an der Chinese University of Hong Kong. Er ist außerdem assoziierter Mitarbeiter am Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society der Harvard University in diesem und im nächsten Jahr. Und er ist Partner des Digital Asia Hub und Point of View. Nishant wird auf Englisch sprechen. Diejenigen, die dafür eine Übersetzung brauchen, den würde ich jetzt empfehlen, in den deutschen Channel zu wechseln. Ansonsten übergebe ich dir, Nishant, den Floor. Ich bin ganz gespannt auf den Vortrag.
All right. Thank you very much, Francesca, for the introduction and also for the explanation of looking at some of the things that I'm going to speak today. Good evening, everyone. My name is Nishant. I am of Indian origin. I'm a Dutch national, so ik verstehe een bisschen Deutsch, but only understand it. I don't really speak it. And right now I am in Bangkok, so it's midnight for me. But I'm very excited that I get to share some of my recent work with you. Today's talk is based on a paper that was recently published with the Open Gender Journal, and I can share a link with you later if you want to download it and want to deep dive into it. I will try and stay faithful to the research publication, but I will also not be able to attend to all the different nuances of the writing. I'll also try and make the work more concrete by looking at 4 different real-life instances that serve as an anchor point for thinking about gender and sexuality, digital platforms, and the possibility of future interventions. So let me begin with the testimony of former Facebook employee Frances Haugen to the United States Congress. Haugen revealed that Facebook and Instagram have deliberately incentivized, programmed, and platformed violence against women on their sites. Right? She says in her testimony that the harms that Facebook and Instagram cause to young women make them feel bad.
Nishant, I think your sound is gone now, but maybe your earbuds already kicked in again.
Okay, can you hear me now? Sorry. So Frances Haugen was saying that the harms that Facebook and Instagram cause to young women, making them often feel bad about their bodies, are avoidable and that they are reversible. Right? She goes on to declare that the company's leadership knows of these harms and have repeatedly encountered conflicts between the company's profits and our safety, and consistently resolve those conflicts in favor of profits. She insists that their profit optimizing machine is generating self-harm and self-hate, especially for vulnerable groups like teenage girls. As an experienced Facebook employee, Haugen ends her testimony by asking for radical transparency to establish conditions of accountability towards building our common good. So there is no denying the fact that Haugen's testimony is brave, powerful, poignant, and held global attention. And it's also necessary to accept that she was not telling us anything new, at least if we were listening to other voices from other parts of the world. Right? In many ways, there was nothing new about Haugen's testimony that scholarship from women, queer and trans rights scholars in other parts of the world have proven and shown. That these platforms weaponize information to harm, hurt, intimidate, and erase women and gender and race non-conforming people in the networks. Similarly, her call for radical transparency as the solution is a very weak echo of the interventions already being made to make decision-making in platforms subjected to oversight and accountability. I'm kind of triggered by Hogan's critique and solutions because they are easily acceptable. They do not question the fundamental architectures and intentions of these platforms, but instead keep on reinforcing the narrative that if only we produce more oversight, more regulation, more checks and balances, automatically these things will become better. This particular approach to keeping our platforms safe for the vulnerable people is like asking to de-weaponize a gun. It doesn't question the harms and violence that are architected into the platforms, and it doesn't question the technological promises that we believe in, which continue to extend the dominance and naturalize the intentions of these platforms. And in much of the discourse on platforms, when gender appears, it's mobilized in terms of economic categories of labor and production, or political values of access and ownership, or governance structures of redress and justice, or cultural practices of representation and creation. So gender resides, and leaves residues on these platforms, but it's not necessarily something endemic to the study of or critical to the analysis of these platform practices. And that's why I kind of begin with this testimony of Frances Haugen, because if we must pay it attention, it must be to focus on how gender is not just a site of exploitation through platformization. That the production, circulation, manipulation, and distortion of gender in sexual bodies and their images is at the core of how these platforms are actually built. Gender is not something that's studied on the platform, but like infrastructure, data, code, programming, technology, and governance, it has become a central trope through which the platforms are operationalized, governed, maintained, and sustained. That exploiting and targeting specifically gendered bodies is the core business of platformization. It's not just an unhappy coincidence. That online gender-based violence is the feature and not a bug when it comes to social media platforms. And I'm proposing that the way in which we keep on continuing the proliferation of these platforms is by accepting the promises it offers. So the research which informs this paper, which is about 3 years looking at online gender-based violence questions, proposes the framework of platform promises to shift our focus from the presence of gendered bodies online to how gender politics are coded into the very logic and infrastructure of these platforms. So it kind of is an attempt to stop the narrative of good platforms where bad people do bad things and refuse to accept platforms as neutral or benign entities. Gender then in this context is not an example or a site or a case study for illustration, but a toolkit that helps us perhaps break open the platform promises and also rewrites them by looking at bodily safety at the center of platformization discourse. And drawing inspiration from the feminist principles of the internet, but also departing from that, for our talk today, I'm offering 2 platform promises, which can perhaps be rewritten. The publication deals with more, but I want to honor the time we have and not kind of keep on talking about everything that's in the essay. Hopefully, if you find this interesting, you'll go and read more of it. Okay, let me begin with the first one, that the promise of networked digitalization is scale. The imagination that we will be able to reach across the globe into millions of nodes of information, all connected by the sheer joy of sharing information, has been very, very seductive in selling the narrative of digital networks, right? Because platforms find their emergence in these imaginations of scale. They value traffic, engagement, circulation, and spread as the new currency. So much so that in our big data futures, information that does not scale is dead. But this narrow focus on scale and platforms makes way for strange conditions of gendered harms. And one of the most illustrative cases that exemplifies this is a controversy that emerged in India in the midst of the global pandemic. So in July 2021, an open source app called Sully Deals went viral in India. Created by a trad group, this app posted pictures and personal information of Muslim women online. Each profile presented as a deal of the day. It invited a mock auction where buyers were invited to express extreme Islamophobia, misogyny, and violent and abusive fantasies of what they would do to these women, collectively creating expressions and intentions of mass violence and abuse. In January 2022, Omkareshwar Thakur, the man on the slide, was identified as the creator of this app and was arrested by the Delhi police. So after multiple regulatory attempts, the app was taken down from Microsoft-owned open code commons called GitHub, where it was hosted. The Sully Deals account, which hosted the app, was also deleted. These technological interventions were made, the platform was debunked, and the small number of women identifiably harmed in the process were offered support. But because the app did not last long and had targeted about 80 women in its lifetime, the harms of the app were not seen as scalar, but as an individual, right? So the app was seen as an aberration, both because it wasn't to scale, even though it had like 1.2 million Twitter followers, that was not seen as a scalar evidence. And because while it had a scaled audience, it did not have scaled victims. Cathy O'Neill, who's one of my favorite feminist mathematicians, has a book called Weapons of Math Destruction. And she warns us that scale is not only the aspiration, but also the justification of digital networks. Because scale is the primary reason given to the networks to exist, interventions that can stop the harms of such network apps and platforms also need to be at scale. Sully Deal as an app was not just an app gone wrong as if it was an exceptional case. When the app was removed from GitHub, an account was suspended from Twitter, it's important to realize that the scale of harms is not the same as the scale of network expansion. That networked computational scale often creates a disconnection between the lived experience of informational violence and the circulation of violent information. Platforms depend on algorithmic scaling, creating instant copies, and enabling simultaneous spread of information that cannot be controlled by individual regulations. Regulating technological scale through human experience and thus making human-sized interventions in stopping the spread of information is an exercise in redundancy. Hence, the non-scaled Sully Deals was removed and the case was closed. But the scale of harms was way beyond the occurrence of the app and the small number of women it targeted. The app might have pulled out of circulation, but its harms remained. And so in less than a month, another app came into being. It took the name of Bully Buy. It used the same open source code and platform mechanism of Sully Deals from GitHub, replicating the entire database and processes in its new avatars. I'm suggesting that we rewrite the promise of scale, which necessarily exploits gendered hatred and violence, and we replace scale with intensity. Intensity disrupts the promise of scale in two ways. First, it insists that conditions of harm do not have to be expansive for regulation to happen. And even when the violence and abuse of harmful information is targeted at small numbers, it needs to be taken seriously and immediately acted upon, right? So that was the first proposition I have, is to realize that platforms promise scale, and we continue to agree that scale is the only way by which platforms can be measured and sustained. and that perhaps we need to replace scale with intensity to stop these kinds of harmful replications from happening. It's also good to realize that scale offers us a different way of thinking about the scale of regulations, because demanding that the intensity that comes from attacks on safety, dignity, freedom, and liberty have to be taken seriously in this platformization of gender, and that the interventions cannot be limited to individual redress or a brand-specific platform accountability, but that complete recalibration of network platforms is needed. Because scale converts people into data. Intensity demands that this data becomes embodied again, and that we recognize digital governance as embodied governance, bringing gendered practices of the body into the conversation around regulation of digital technologies. That the body and its well-being have to become the unboxing principles of rewriting the platform promises of desirable scale. If scale has been the primary promise of platforms, then interactivity has been the premise of it, right? The rush to put everything onto platforms, creating specific and targeted data-driven customizations for the gig economy, have put interactivity with different elements and shaping or manipulating them in order to create what Wendy Chun calls network neighborhoods. And this has become the mainstay of platformization. But interactivity is not merely the ability to interact with different elements. It is also the emergence of transactability. Human rights and technology lawyer Kelly Kim, in her work in South Korea, reconstructs a specific case of data sharing that looks benign under the lens of interactivity, but belies its intended breach of privacy when understood as transactability. So Lee Luda was an AI chatbot service developed in Scatterlab in Seoul in December 2020. It had a gendered anthropomorphized presence and took the virtual profile of a 20-year-old female college student. And we need to have a conversation about why all the technologies which we produce as our assistants necessarily always look like female forms. But anyway, Lee Luda was introduced to the world, and it came with the tagline which says, "Hi, I'm your first AI friend, Lee Luda." People could add it to their social media, chat with it on Facebook Messenger, and have long text-based conversations. There was an immediate initial excitement that Lee Luda's conversations were natural, human-like, and engaging, thus generating more than 400,000 subscribers in the first 2 weeks of launching. But two problems quickly arose. Lee Luda was being trained on a public conversation dataset, thus mimicking and inheriting expressions of violence, discrimination, and hate speech, disproportionately targeting women, queer persons, and migrant minorities. The unchecked training set amplified the misogyny online and once again allowed and used for gender-based violence as the premise of expansion and scalar circulation. Additionally, because Lee Luda was having customized conversations to recognize profiles, it also started directing these only at particular user types. So if you were a cis, ethnically Korean, straight man, Lee Luda was a perfect companion. But if you were a Filipino migrant worker working in Seoul, then Lee Luda would actually treat you badly because it recognizes you as a specific form of personality or persona or a digital identity, which can be treated badly as it learns from its training datasets. The second problem was even more difficult because Lee Luda was also trained on another private information dataset that Scatterlab had collected from its users for other services that they offer. And Lee Luda was not only learning and internalizing that dataset of private information, but was also harvesting new information to populate those fields in its interaction with the new users. In this process, Lee Luda started leaking real-life information, addresses, phone numbers, health records, employment histories. This was information that the users had given to another service by the company, but the same data set was now being leaked into new application for which users had not consented to give their data. The anonymous user interacting with Lee Luda suddenly became tied to a real-life identity and was exploited for data manipulations and identifications. I don't need to perhaps expand upon the potentials of outing and doxing women, queer persons, and minorities that Lee Luda was already abusing using learned behavior from its real-time conversations, and how it amplified because it now could attach private data. So you could literally go online and ask, is my colleague gay? And Lee Luda would out your colleague as gay because it has this information data set from another profile elsewhere. Abusive ex-partners could go to Lee Luda and ask for new contact details of their ex-girlfriends or wives or partners, and then dox them again and get in touch with them to perpetuate new forms of online violence. So thinking through these questions of data, scope, and consent, I'm suggesting that when it comes to digital platforms, interactivity, which is a promise, has to be rewritten and re-understood as transactability. Interactivity enables extraction and hence transaction of information and data, which is structured around the spread of gendered violence and exposure of vulnerable groups. The way to resist the imperative of interactivity is to position data as inalienable. Interactivity is a process of transactions that puts profits and circulation over safety and harms. And it's necessary to move away from the rhetoric of interactivity and label it as a sinister attempt at making human data and its assemblages hugely commodified and circulated in the platform economies. A gendered rewriting of the imperative of interactivity is to identify it as transactability, and thus immediately favoring data as live embodied forms of being, which are not to be compromised as negotiable elements of technological design. In this rewriting, gender becomes an integral part from platform data as it is of our bodies, making data inalienable from our lived realities, and thus creating new structures of accountability which go beyond technological innovations. So scale is the promise of the network, interactivity of the interface, and the third promise that platforms come with is the production of measures. At the core of a digital platform is a set of standards, protocols, ontologies, and taxonomies that shape the ways in which information is measured. Platforms measure things. They definitely measure gender, assigning different values, typologies, and worth to gendered bodies and representations. However, the real promise is not about measuring things, because that would be true of almost all media and technological forms. But we have to realize that platforms now create measures that our body has to measure up to. In our last book, Really Fake, Alexandra Juhasz and I argue that digital virility constantly demands that bodies and identities be technologically, socially, culturally, and politically be viral and shareable. And we need to perhaps stop fighting against and resisting this idea that every piece of information and every body that comes online needs to be viral. So I want to reiterate that while there is much work needed on thinking about platforms and digital regulation to protect gender bodies and persons, there is not enough attention being paid to how imaginaries of gender and algorithmic practices of violence and extraction are not the afterthought of platform applications, but actually the very core of them. that when we think about digital gender, we can start thinking about gender not as something that is invoked in the application, but in the very construction of the platforms that we use and embody. And this attempt at rewriting platform promises by positioning gender as an analytic tool, as well as a central organizing principle of these network platforms, is a way of approaching the problematic space of platformization beyond just the revelatory mechanism of crisis and despair. That locating gender as endemic to understanding technological platforms allows us to think about new modes of negotiation and agency, vitalizing the idea that platforms and gender are co-constitutive, and that our role as researchers and practitioners and users and people in government is going to be to rewrite the technological promises beyond just technological solutions. I think I'm going to stop here right now. Thank you very much for your patient listening. If you want to get in touch with me, this is my email. Or I'm lately on time on Instagram, Blue Sky, and Twitter, and you can also tag me there. I'll stop here because I think there might be more questions or conversations. I know that there is a lot of different expertise in the room right now, and I'm very eager to hear about how you think about it. And let's get into a chat. Thank you very much.
Mich ganz herzlich bei dir, Nishant, bedanken. Ich fand es wirklich einen ganz bereichernden Vortrag. Ganz toll. Wir bleiben, genau, ganz herzlichen Dank auch nochmal auch von ZuschauerInnen. Ich habe sehr, sehr, sehr viel mitgenommen, sehr viele Denkanstöße mitgenommen und genau, ich freue mich, wenn wir in Kontakt bleiben. Ich freue mich auch, wenn ich einige von Ihnen euch wiedersehe zur nächsten Veranstaltung in der Reihe. Die findet am 22. November statt, wieder um 18 Uhr. Und da wird Kanter Dihal einen Vortrag geben zur Dekolonisierung von KI-Erzählung, also wie sozusagen über KI in Literatur erzählt wird und wie wir da dekoloniale Ansätze fruchtbar machen können. Das wird auch ein ganz spannender Vortrag. Genau, nochmal ganz herzlichen Dank. Ich wünsche einen schönen Dienstagabend. Dir, Nishant, eine geruhsame Nacht dann jetzt und bis ganz bald. Dir auch, Hanna, ganz lieben Dank und auch natürlich den Übersetzungen ganz herzlichen Dank. Ohne die hätte es ja heute auch gar nicht gut geklappt.
Ja, danke auch an meiner Stelle und eine
Yeah,
gute Nacht.
thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye bye.